Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program featuring Cornelius Eady and Joe Morton in conversation about their Audible original play, Brutal Imagination. I'm Allison Cuddy. I'm the artistic director at the festival. It's so great to be here with you. We are almost finished with our spring season. We have a few more programs coming up. You can check those out at chicagohumanities.org. And if you're able, consider becoming a member, which starts, our annual membership starts at $50. We'd love for you to support us. Whatever you do though, stay in touch because we have lots of great announcements coming up about the fall season. So stick with us. So this digital event, like all of our digital events, has captioning. You can activate that right here in YouTube. And now on to the program. Cornelius Eady is a superb poet and the co-founder of Cave Canem. His collection, Brutal Imagination, was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award in Poetry. Be sure to catch the Audible original play version of Brutal Imagination. It is free if you have an Audible membership. And if you do check it out, you will see Joe Morton appearing as Mr. Zero. Morton is an Emmy award-winning film, television, and stage veteran. He's best known as Rowan Eli Pope in Shonda Rhimes' groundbreaking series Scandal, although I loved him in many of his films, including Brother from Another Planet and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So now please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, Joe Morton and Cornelius Eady.
Cornelius, good to see you once again.
Yeah, always good to see you, Joe.
Listen, I know I asked you this before we got started, but can you tell us about, because I know you have a band. I'm not sure that everybody else has a band. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because of the music that actually starts when we did our little video of Brutal Imagination, but you actually wrote a song having to do with Amy Cooper, which I think really sort of connects to what we did with Brutal Imagination.
Yes, I have a folk trio. It's myself and guitarist Charlie Rao and Lisa Liu. We've been playing together in various configurations, first as a rock band, but now as a folk trio for about 7 or 8 years. And the Amy Cooper song is called Bird Watching. And I wrote it after, the incident in Central Park between Chris and Amy Cooper. How ridiculous that story was, but it was also, man, it was also unfortunately on the same day that George Floyd was murdered by the police. So that was part of that as well. I didn't realize it at the time when I wrote it a few days afterwards after the incident. I forgot that George Floyd was also happened on the same day, and there's a line in the song where now the cop kneels down to pray. Right, right, and it was just, it was subconscious, right? But it ties the two things together, and this was also the catalyst for us doing Brutal Imagination.
That's right. Yeah, that's what sort of brought it back up again, And you and I have talked about this before, which is the idea that it seems like almost since Birth of a Nation, the idea of Black men and white women have been the catalyst, if you will, for all kinds of horrible events. Susan Smith being one, Tulsa being another, Emmett Till being another, the Scottsboro Boys being yet another. I wonder how much did that, when you wrote the original series of poems, which is where the play actually came from, did that idea sort of ferment any of that at all?
No. When I did it, when I was doing the poetry cycle for Brutal Imagination, what I was really trying to get at was trying to figure out, why, why was it so damn easy for Susan Smith to pull this guy out of the ether? And yes, I knew there was a historical, thread there, of course, but it's more concentrating on just who this imaginary guy was, and why it was so easy for her to tap into that, right? In my mind, he was sort of like this. Historically, he's like a golem, right? He's just, he's there, as he says, to get things done, right?
Right.
The things he gets done is horrible. So that was the sort of like the idea. That was sort of like the thread. And I tried to figure out, well, who was he then, right? And how did he feel about it, right? Right? How did he feel to be, always available to be, doing the biddings of these people, right? Of these white people, and so that's a little bit of the DNA of it. right? But I was really trying to get into the center of what that was. 9 days, people just so easily accepting the possibility.
That possibility, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, because I watched actually last night on CNN one of the documentaries on Tulsa, and they brought up Birth of a Nation, and I guess I began to wonder why that particular Zero says, why am I so interested in wives and children? Yes, wives and children.
Yeah.
So then if you take that one step or 12 steps further, then why is the mythology of Black men always connected to white women? I mean, because as I say, as far as back as 1915,
yeah.
Birth of a Nation, suddenly the center of that story is the horror of some Black man trying to rape a white woman. Tulsa, again, is there's an accident in an elevator between a Black young boy, a 19-year-old boy, and Sarah Page, I believe was her name.
Oh, you know her name? Oh,
I only found that out last night. Sarah Page and Dick Rowland, the two involved. And actually, for the first time last night, they actually proposed what might have happened. Apparently, she was the elevator operator.
Oh.
And it was one of those old-fashioned elevators that have to be operated with a wheel sort of thing. And this one was very difficult to control. So the theory is, when the elevator came up, he was shining shoes in a white building. This building that he'd come into was the only building where there was a restroom for Black people. So that's why he came into the building to the first place, up to the 4th floor. And when he got onto the elevator somehow was not level, and he may have tripped on his way in. And when he tripped on his way in, the natural reflex was to put his hands up, and that's why he grabbed her dress, and that's how it got ripped. She screamed, and when she screamed, panicked, according to the myth, and ran. And yet someone else who saw him run, saw the torn dress, put 2 and 2 together, and said something terrible had happened.
And off we go.
And off we go. But there again is, so the original thought here is, though, why, as Mr. Zero said, why wives and children? Why am I so interested? And why in the mythology of the world that we live in, why Black men and white women? What is it that's being protected or guarded or what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. With Zero, in Zero's case, it's basically, that a Black man could be horrible enough to kidnap 2 white women, two white children,
yeah.
And then just go off into the night with them, and basically, from my point of view, in the script, there's a moment when Susan's trying to convince Shirley MacLaine, the house that she runs to after the car goes down, that horrible thing has happened. That first it's a man, carjacked my kids, and then I think she has to emphasize to make sure that it's how horrible it is, and where she goes, that jump from man to Black man.
Yes, right, exactly.
Is what we're talking about here, right?
Yes, yeah. Right? Because it's interesting that her first thought is a man jumped into the car, and then the second thought is a Black man, the golden ticket. The Black man jumped into the car, and so everyone will believe me, and so it goes.
Right, so everyone will believe me, and it taps into this idea of just like, it's horrible. Yeah, they could do that. Who knows what they're capable of, right? It's that kind of thing, right? Right, and so with defies all logic, right, or sense all logic, but the word Black man, the words Black man, right, was enough, and she knew it would be enough. Just like Amy Cooper thought it would be enough to take care of Chris Cooper, or to either make him run, or to have the police come and do her dirty work for her, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when she gets on the phone, she tells Chris, I'm gonna call the police and tell them that a Black man is attacking me, right? Right. And Chris Cooper stands his ground and basically says, okay, go ahead and do it, because it's so ridiculous. But he's also filming it on his own phone, right? So when the cops show up there, they can see what actually happened, and they can see her ramping it up, right? And that part of I remember that very clearly. That moment when she's she's talking on the phone, and then suddenly she realizes, just like Susan, right? It's not enough, so she has to really kind of like ramp herself up and go, oh, God! She does the same thing.
She nearly kills the dog in doing so.
Yeah, while the poor dog is like, but that's the emphasis, right? Right, Black man is attacking me, right?
Yeah.
So a Black man kidnapped my kids, right? So it just cuts, it just stops all rational thought, right, and all logic. It is simply it's just like, oh yeah, it's gotta be bad. And you're right, it taps into this idea of violation, right?
Yeah, and also again, because you do it in the play as well, where Zero talks about. He says, some point in your life, somebody pointed across the tracks and said, Coontown, Chocolateville, so and so and so forth. The same thing happened in Tulsa before the actual event happened. The local paper kept talking about Greenwood as being that same kind of town, chocolate town, booze and drugs and terrible people live over there. So that it was all building up to the final massacre. And I wonder the same thing is true here, where I think there is this ongoing mythology of if we maintain the idea that Black men in general are not to be trusted, are drug dealers, are pimps, are people who will attack white women, then it's easy for the rest of the country to sort of say, oh yeah, then he must have done it.
Yeah.
He must have done it.
Yeah, and in the Smith case, luckily, it didn't turn into somebody who was innocent, being picked up, and then arrested, and and either serving a life sentence right now, or just got the needle, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where the stuff we're tapping into is very old and ugly, and with Tulsa, also you're right. It's not just only just the idea of the idea of the town, but also that part of town, but also how successful that part of town was.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Well, that's right.
Yeah. Right. I mean, with the Black Wall Street, right? I mean, it's there. So there's obviously long gestation period of resentment, right? That found a trigger, right? It gave them the excuse to go and do what they wanted to do all along, which is basically wipe it out. But there was also that envy. The part of the fleshing out of Mr. Zero as you were pointing out, is also partly because when I did my research on Susan Smith, I realized that she didn't have any Black friends.
Right.
So I was trying to figure out how does she know Black people, right? So that's where I get, maybe my gaze is that something that ricocheted off you when you saw some kids in a playground, or some Black kids in a playground. Your idea of your distance fantasy about who we are and what we do and how we operate, right, is part of the flesh and blood of me, Mr. Zero, right? So I was trying to use that as a measurement of trying to figure out what the parameters of this were for her, right? And she didn't have any Black friends. She was just tapping this idea of the boogeyman, right?
But she was aware of Uncle Tom. She was aware of Aunt Jemima. She was aware of Buckwheat and Step and Fetch It. And the beauty of what you do in the play is then you bring in Stagger Lee, and Stagger Lee says, "Who does she think she is? I'm not that guy."
right. She wants a real gangster. Right. She can't handle a real gangster, right?
Yeah, she could not handle the real. But I think it's brilliant of you to bring in those other stereotypes, because it is what everybody knows. It is with Uncle Tom, he is the ultimate servant, and as you point out in the play, he is the guy who now, if you are an Uncle Tom, you're on the wrong side of whatever.
Right.
Aunt Jemima is another servant character, someone who feeds you, someone who takes care of you. But again, the fear of what her thing is. So what's all that with her hair? What is that stuff? Let's just put that in a bun so we can't even see it. And then of course, Stagger Lee and Buckwheat, those two characters are, completely benign and benevolent and I suppose on some level trustworthy, not to hurt anybody, which is what makes Stagger Lee so wonderfully poignant in that series of mythology.
Yeah, I actually love that you're Stagger Lee. Stagger Lee is just
Who do you think she is?
Right, who do you think she is? I mean, it's just brilliant. I love the voice. I love it when we in the video, as well, but it works both versions, and and you just hear, the dripping, this contempt, right, for her little fantasy. But that's also exactly what I was trying to get at. I was trying to get at the fact that we all float in this soup, right? right? And that's how she knows African Americans, right?
Right.
This idea of this what our tropes are, right? Right? We either serve or we're dangerous, right? And it's like, and there's the good blacks and there's the bad blacks, and she was trying to make a bad black. Her idea of what a bad black guy was going to be, right? I remember also the part in the play or in the poems where basically I make her talk about why. Zero would say why I'm not a woman, right?
Right.
Right. And I got that poem from Bell Hooks. Yeah, when Bell Hooks was living in the village, my wife and I have an apartment in the West Village, and Bell Hooks was living in the West Village. We occasionally have lunch together, and when I was putting Brutal Imagination together, I was talking to her about it, because it's like all this stuff about race, and we're talking about this, and she said, "Yeah, that's right. She'd never be a woman. He'd never be a woman.
Would be,
right?
No.
No one would have believed that for 5 seconds." A black woman jumped into my car, pushed me out, and kidnapped my kids. Right? You gotta catch her, right? Right? That would have been the end of the story, right? Right.
So, well, it's not, and again, it's not part of the mythology, is it? I mean, it's
that's
not.
Yeah, right.
It's just not there. But the way you do it is great. So if a woman would say, "Well, wait, how could I do this? Because I have to deal with all of the things that are in that car. If in fact I had done it, I have to deal with what it means to be finally not just a woman, but a mother."
Right, exactly, and that again reinforces that how impossible that is, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, it's like so the idea is like right, and you kind of think in a way. She also kind of so she kind of edits that as she's jumping from man to black man, right? In a way, right? She sort of sifts it through and goes, right? It can't be a black woman. It's got to be a black man. It's got to be a young black man.
Black man,
right? Right, and off we go. And what I love about what you did with the rethinking of this play was your idea of making sure that it goes back to the almost original idea of the poems, where you've got two consciousness in one body,
one personality. That's right.
and one personality, and I think that really just shines through in this version of it. When I did the play, of course, the idea was to try to separate it and make him physical, right? He can't be in the head, because you got to be able. It's a play, and you've got to be able to see him. He's got to move 3D, in the world, right? Interact with them, interact with Susan, and interact with the audience. So this is closer to the idea of what the poems would be like, all in her head, right? All her brutal imagination, so to speak.
That's right. And I mean, it is her brutal imagination, and it is finally that imagination that pushes her to the truth, because right after the series of mythological characters, right after Stagger Lee, her invented black man says no, because none of these things exist. There is no car, there is no steering wheel, there is no rearview mirror. None of those things exist. So what are you going to do? How are you going to move forward? Which ultimately becomes the question I think that America has to face when it comes to black people in general. If we are constantly being blamed for things that we did, or maybe we did, then we do again become the consciousness of the country. I mean, you cannot, right. My favorite saying is, you cannot blame black people for being lazy if in fact they are your slave. Right.
Yeah, right. Well, having it both ways is also part of the situation, isn't it? Right. You want to have it both ways. You want to punish them, but also have them serve you. Right.
And also you want to make sure that when they're not serving you, because after what the 13th Amendment is the one that sort of made everything criminal, right? So that they were brought here in chains, and that's both dominance and criminality. And then after the shackles were sort of thrown away, then Jim Crow made them criminal, and then segregation made them criminal, and redlining made them criminal. And so, and then the interesting thing, I'm sure you've done all this reading, is the two ultimate stereotypes, the so-called blonde woman and the black man, are the most volatile in the country.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And right, all those codes, right, that get set up for you to trip over, right? But that's been the fuel of this country. And I agree with you. I totally agree with you that our role has been this being the conscience of this nation, right? From the very beginning, just sort of missing the opportunity, to actually settle this. In the Constitution, and all that moment when they had a moment when they shifted and they decided to kick the can down the road about slavery, right? So we're still kicking that can, and we haven't really confronted this, right? We figured out ways of patchwork. I mean, the fact that we're sitting here, talking together. I mean, is some signs of progress, but you can't go you can't go any further, I think, until you finally get to admit what happens, what has happened, and how it's affected everybody. Everyone. Also, I think that one of the big errors people make about race is they think it's only about Black people, right?
Right. Which is why I wish Sally was here, because then she could add her voice in terms of the white woman. You know what I mean? Yes. Sally.
I mean, I regret that too, because I think Sally would really have a lot to say about that. Also, a lot to say about coming back to that role 20 years later, right? Right. Just how that feels, right? After knowing, after being away for 20 years and the country going on the way it's gone, and now coming back to that person again, that persona again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how did it feel for you, by the way?
I mean, I think it began to, again, because we were looking at it, or certainly I was looking at it in a very different way, it began to answer or reaffirm things that I've always felt. I mean, it's interesting that we call him Mr. Zero because he's a non-entity in terms of Susan Smith, but at the same time, he is history. He is mythology. He is all of the things that you just talked about in terms of the things we won't speak about. We would prefer not to talk about, let's say, the insurrection of January 6th. We would prefer not to talk about Black Lives Matter. We would prefer not to talk about slavery and all of the things that occurred after slavery. We would prefer to say, oh, but that was 100 years ago. That stuff doesn't matter anymore. Well, if it didn't matter anymore, George Floyd wouldn't be dead.
Right.
If it didn't matter anymore, Susan Smith would not have chosen to call the Black man the kidnapper. When you were saying, we've come a long way, this morning I woke up thinking, I get asked that question a lot as an actor. Have things changed? And this morning I thought, well, I guess, if you have Morgan Freeman playing God, on some level, things have changed.
Right.
But that was a comedy. So
yeah. You're right. Also, Morgan Freeman played the first Black president of the United States.
That's right.
But when he did, a meteor came to destroy the earth.
That's right.
Can't have it both ways, right? Right.
So all of those things are, yes, we have made certain kinds of progress. There are certain opportunities that are available today that weren't available even 20 years ago, certainly not 50 years ago. But at the same time, it's ironic that we're facing the same kinds of problems, that we have to have a trial about the murder of George Floyd, that Black Lives Matter is the new NAACP, that we have to worry about Black, not only women not being able to get employed in terms of the results of the pandemic, but Black women on top of that.
Yeah.
So it's that old saying, I suppose. The more things change, the more things remain the same.
Yeah. Well, also I've said many times, I'm quoting Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
Rhymes. That's right. There you go.
Right. And he's right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's where we keep going. It keeps rhyming, right? And we don't get past it, right? I thought that for me, the one of the things that I learned this time doing the show, both in Audible and also as the video, was that for me it became a little more clearer that it's also part of the process that we part of that process we were talking about. We have to go through to get to the truth, to let go of it. Right? For Susan to let go of it, she has to admit it. Right?
That's right.
She's got to admit it. She's got to get through it. She has to go through it and actually, see it, touch it, admit it. I did it. It wasn't some Black person. It was me. I did it, right? But to be free of it, to go on, and I don't mean she's free and she's liberated, she's happy she killed her kids. I mean, but to get to someplace else, she has to go through that door, right? right? And really, it really struck me this time seeing the show and listening to the show. That it felt like that to me now. That was kind of like a metaphor for that, right?
I think you're right. I mean, I think that is the problem. We have not, as a country, gone through that door. We have not sort of turned around and said, this is what happened and why. And this is what we were left with, and this is what we did with it and why.
Right.
We would much prefer just to sort of shove it under the rug and pretend that things are all hunky-dory. You know, Obama was president, so racism must be over.
Over, right? Yeah, happy days, right?
Right.
And then you turn around and you do the complete 80.
Yeah, 180, absolutely.
right,
yes.
right. You get the worst of the worst, right? Just to, but you're right. I mean, it's like getting to that point is really why I thought was really significant about the play this time. But that was the sort of news I got from doing it, right? And hearing it. But it was, but we also, we're just, how we get past this is really what I'm thinking about these days, right? So the also what was interesting about it was also about the production to me was also that the way it was put together this time, right? Right, which I also felt was the sort of like you couldn't do this. This wouldn't have happened anyway without the pandemic. It wouldn't have happened the way
we wouldn't have done it that way necessarily.
We wouldn't have done it that way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we simply would have just had a table reading, perhaps they got recorded, right? And then or maybe we go into a studio and just do it, and we couldn't do that because we had this little virus was going around, causing trouble, and at the we're in 2021 right now, and looking backwards through 2020, which was a horrible year, in so many ways. I was also thinking because it was yesterday was my 43rd wedding anniversary.
Oh, congratulations!
Right, and I was sitting on the beach with my wife on Long Island, and I was telling my wife, basically, boy, really 2020 really sucked. It really sucked, but on the other hand, and 2021, we have Brutal Imagination back out in the world. When I was in lockdown, I ended up writing over 50 or 60 songs and recording it with the trio. And I'm hoping there's going to be some other things, coming down the road because of that. And, but the way we had to cope was also part of what made the production the way it turned out, right?
Yes.
And so that's also, I think part of this as well. The idea that we had to persevere through something else that wouldn't have happened any other way, right?
I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point. I think on one hand, there were things, certainly Amy Cooper and George Floyd, but there was the inability to do anything person to person. So the urgency of it all sort of forced us to say we have to do something. We have to get this out somehow. Yeah. And the interesting thing is we did it twice. We got it out on Audible and we got it out at the Vineyard Theater.
Right, and I also remember now that you're saying this, that also part of the reason that we were dealing with George Floyd is because people couldn't leave.
That's right. That's right. They were stuck in their homes. They couldn't walk away. There it was on the television sets. I don't care what news outlet they wanted to watch. It was there. It was there. There.
Right. I mean, George Floyd was going to be the Emmett Till moment for this generation.
I think that's really true. Absolutely.
Where it's just so horrific and you couldn't turn away, and most of the country gets repulsed by it, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just so raw,
Which takes me to another thought. I think you said the other day when we were talking, you said something to the effect that if Susan Smith had done what she did 27 years ago, that she might today get away with it.
Yeah, that was probably me being flipped, but also there's a point of that. There's a point of that, right? Because it's because you could see that happen. You could see there's a scenario. Well, let's go back to what really happened, right? There actually was some gesture made by the sheriff
That's right.
to round people up, possible suspects, and interview them. Now, he always had, I think at a certain point, maybe from the second or third day, he probably had an idea that maybe Susan had something to do with this, but he couldn't put his finger on it. But the community was asking to have, some sort of action being made.
Right.
And so he picked people up and interrogated them. Now,
Yeah.
now, right? When I know from the sister of the lead defense lawyer who defended Susan Smith during the trial, that town was just itching to have it over with.
Yeah, I'm sure.
To get it done, just find somebody. And now, the odds probably would be a little higher to make sure you get somebody who's close enough, or you go to somebody's house, you see the cops coming for you, you start running.
Or as in the case of Ferguson or any one of those other, you end up with a riot again. Tulsa, you end up
right.
You end up in that kind of situation.
Right. Where you've got to take care of you've got to get the revenge the wrong, right? So it's I mean it could happen. I mean the odds of that happening now are higher, I think. Which is when you think about it, sad when you think about.
Well, it's that kind of an irony, isn't it? If on one hand we can say George Floyd, what's his name, the cop gets his upcomings. He's in jail, but at the same time, the fear would be that there was a great possibility that he was going to walk.
Yeah,
I mean, which is kind of a strange tightrope to have to walk these days.
Well, it's not only a strange tightrope to walk, it also tells you a little bit about our psyche right now, right? That we've having seen it over and over again, we've been ingrained. It's been ingrained in us that cops get away with this stuff, right? Right? That either the police let them walk, or the juries let them walk, or and they do great harm and great damage, right? And that's the other thing, of course, it's about this. It's the damage that Susan Smith does to that community. That's part of this show, but also the damage she does to herself, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that's again, people don't quite get that idea, that racism, is such a double-edged sword, as they say, right? It cuts the victim, and it also cuts the perpetrator, I mean, it dehumanizes everybody, right? So, but it's also about power,
Yes.
And that's of course that's what we're floating in right now at this moment. This idea that the idea of some sort of black equity or black power in terms of like voting, for example,
Yes,
is something that needs to be tamped down, right? Because it was so successful. In the 2020 election, right? What they saw was the result of a lot of organizing, to make sure that the voting laws that were very, very already very bad, didn't interfere. I clearly remember President Obama and Michelle just basically saying, get some water, get some food, just stand, you're gonna have to stand in that line, just do it, right? So what do? They make it illegal.
Make it illegal.
Water,
that's right.
have food and water in a line, right? I mean, because they're it's a response about how successful it is, right? But also is that the idea that somehow they're going to be losing power, right? Because the democratic process will actually turn things over. So what you have to do, you have to get rid of the democratic process,
Which is what Biden just said the other day, right, on Memorial Day. He said that that democracy is in great peril, was the quote. And for an American president to sort of say that, especially on Memorial Day, is a very disturbing kind of thing to consider.
Yeah.
Oh, and then what was it? Michael Flynn, was it Flynn, who used to be with Trump, said that we should have a coup like they had in Myanmar.
I didn't hear that.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's what we're playing with these days, right? This is
Which is very strange. I mean, to think that one, there was an insurgence on January 6th. Two, that there is some small percentage of the American population who think that the only way to change things is vis-a-vis violence.
Yeah.
Is a very weird place to be in this country. I mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily to be black in this country and think of those two things together, but generally speaking.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. The violent overthrow is the only solution here, right? I mean, we're this is yeah. It's really upsetting and scary and
Scary, yeah, absolutely.
scary. This again, this idea of, I guess, this desire just to have um, a minority control, of the country, right? That it'd be kind of like South Africa, I guess, very small knot of government running everyone else, right?
It is that point that you were making before about losing something. So if the country is becoming more black and brown, which it is, then those folks who are not black or brown are then worried about whatever power they had. And from my point of view, I think part of the problem here, which is why we can't, as we said earlier, talk about things like slavery, is that the thought has been for decades, centuries even, that this is a white country. And
right.
and so that the fact that things are changing makes it very difficult for those to accept.
Yeah, right. It's true. Even accepting the fact that so much mixed blood is in this country, it has
That's right.
From the start.
From the start.
Right?
That's right.
From the start, and just simply just refusing to acknowledge that, it just twists everything up into many pretzels, right? And again, we're all dealing with that hypocrisy, and having to deal with that. But again, it ties into this larger thing that's happening right now, where basically. The truth doesn't matter. Facts don't matter, right?
Right.
You can actually see people storming, the Capitol.
And they were tourists. Everybody could see that. They were tourists.
They're just being rambunctious.
Yes, right.
Right. That's why they were breaking.
They were hugging and kissing one another.
Right. That's why they were breaking the doors down.
That's right. They really wanted to get into the Capitol, so they decided to go through the window.
Right. They couldn't wait. They were so excited.
They were so excited.
They're so excited to be surrounded by democracy that they wanted. Yeah. Right. I mean, but that's what we're living with right now. But you're dealing with people that they will simply look you in the eye and say, that never happened, right? Listen, sir, you've got something on your, wasn't that a wound you got? Oh, that never happened.
That's right. No, not at all.
But that's the problem. The problem is that not willfully, denying what's in front of your eyes, willfully denying, that harm was done, right?
Yes.
And actually being kind of, cocky about it, just happy about it, kind of like, yeah, that's right. What are you going to do about it?
I suppose if you believe you're in power, then that's what you do. You say, this is what happened according to, what did they say about history? That history is written by the victor?
Right, exactly. Well, they consider themselves the victor, I guess. But again, that's the sort of like the territory this play is operating in, for me. And again, this production of it really sort of like amplifies it this time, right? It feels more of a piece of this time than it was 20 years ago, right? And it really, at least for me, and I'm biased, of course, but
no, I think that's absolutely accurate. I think that 20 years ago, when we did the play, it really was about two adversaries who are at each other. Different than what we did for Audible, and different than what we did for the Vineyard Theater, which is that now it is basically one individual who is composed of two consciousness, very much like this country. Yeah. One country composed of basically two consciousnesses, one being white, one being non-white, and having to figure out a way to survive.
Yes, survival has always been the part of this. Also, again, go back to part of the DNA of the character of Mr. Zero. I also think that humor is part of it too. It's a survival tactic that he uses. Sarcasm is something he uses as survival, but that's what African Americans have been doing all along. It's a safety valve. It's a defense mechanism. It allows us to sort of like have some sort of sense of not if not control, at least some sense of being able to operate, to open a space where we can actually operate and talk among ourselves. And if they're not going to tell us the truth, we'll tell each other the truth.
Tell each other, and that's what was so brilliant about Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory was the first one to sort of step outside and say, you know what, I'm going to tell it to the white folks and see what they have to say about this.
Yeah.
And he did, and he was brilliant at it.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly right. I mean, I was thinking of Gregory when I was saying that, right? I was just thinking of comics that exactly do that, that bring it, to a larger audience. But it's basically what we tell each other,
that's right,
at home, around the dinner table, in the barber shop, in the beauty salon. I mean, that's how we've been reporting this, right? And those comics like Gregory, just pick it up and just sort of bring it into the world and say, yeah, you know what, this is what we think about y'all.
and also to show how absurd racism actually is, that it doesn't, I think you said this earlier in this conversation, that it just doesn't make any sense. Yeah. There's no logic to it. It's all either political or emotional.
Yeah. And again, that's so hopefully that's going to be something that allows people to have a conversation or a dialogue with. That hopefully, when they see or listen to the show, it brings up those issues, and they start thinking about this. Right? Where are they, the audience, in relationship to this story? Right. And I think it's something that just needs to, again, I think it's something that becomes much more of this moment than it was 20 years ago.
That's an interesting thing to say, that the audience has to say, where are they, who are they in this story? That takes a little bit of courage to decide, I mean, I've always thought it's the racist person who is overtly racist is a scary personality. It's the person who's quiet standing next to them that I'm most afraid of.
Yes, because they'll be the one that'll be wringing their hands and be so sorry they killed you.
That's right. Oh, so sorry that it happened. Oh my God, it was terrible.
Joe, I can't believe they did that to you. But you were standing right there.
I know, but there's nothing I could do
about it, man. Right. I mean, but that's what it is.
That's what it is. So I think part of what this is I suppose is hoping that the audience that listens, and in the case of the Vineyard Theater watches, understands that there is something they can do about it. There are conversations that they can have. There are a kind of soul searching that they can do on their own. And with their friends, and conversations with their Black friends that don't necessarily have to be polite or whatever, that actually can try to dig at some sort of truth, if you will.
Right. It's how we move on. It's how we start to imagine what the future is going to be.
And hopefully that imagination won't be quite as brutal.
Right. Well, like I said, that's what art, to me, that's what art's good for, right? Art, it not only encourages you to imagine, right? You can't move there until you start imagining what it's going to be, right?
Yes.
Right. And you can't imagine what it's going to be until you have some conversations about it. You have to think it before you can invent it, right? Right. And I think that, and I'm hoping that that's what this is contributing to. This idea that maybe, wherever that next step is going to be, that world that's going to be where basically, it's not going to ever be free of racism, but how racism, can be sort of like diminished, or put in a situation where basically, it can only go so far, right? Right. How about living in a world like that, right? Where basically when somebody does something, to a Black body, or to a person of color's body, or to a queer body, right? That everybody understands that that's a violation of justice, right? And how do you imagine that world that we step into, where that comes into the world with us, right?
Maybe that's your next play.
Maybe it's the next play, or maybe I write a play about Stagger Lee and then I have you do it.
Well, there you go.
which I think
would be wonderful. I'd love to do that.
Which I think would be a lot of fun to do.
That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah,
that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that folks will go to Audible and take a listen to the play. Again, I wish Sally had been here. She would have been
Yes.
really contributed to this conversation.
Yes.
And we've done a kind of 1-2 punch here in that we did Audible, which again, I hope people go out and listen to. And then up until June 7th, they can venture over to the Vineyard Theater and watch it being streamed online. So,
Yeah.
And then I hope you and I get to do something together again anyway.
Oh, I know, Joe. It's like really. I mean, this has been for me. This has been the real pleasure and the honor of doing this. This working with you again.
It's been great.
Hanging out with you again.
Yeah.
And just seeing I mean, really, your take on the play is genius.
Thank you.
Absolute genius. And I just I felt totally safe with this, right? Because I knew you know, the only person who knows this story better than me is you. I mean, it's just brilliant the way you've taken it and we imagined it and made it jump right back into our consciousness, and and seeing both you and Sally go at it.
Well, that's been great. Yeah. To work with her again was just terrific. So
yeah, it really was. So I hope we get to work together soon.
It's got to happen.
I know.
We'll do it on Broadway.
Right. Mr. Zero on Broadway.
On Broadway.
Can you handle it? It's been fun, man.
All right.
Thank
Talk
you.
to you soon.
Talk to you again soon. Thanks.